The New York Post has run a story on Hugh Hefner, the now deceased head of Playboy, who cultivated an image as some sort of intellectual hedonist, intellectual libertine, cultivated celebrity in California. Some of the story I have heard from friends in the past who were knowledgeable, and it leaked out on gossip sites as well. I do believe it's true, having heard it from people, that Hefner engaged in hedonism and encouraged others to at his property, the Playboy Mansion, and then filmed it all and could use it as blackmail. And there are all sorts of people who you would not think of who engaged in all sorts of depravity over the years, some of whom you would, obviously. But there's a larger story here, and it's interesting to me that this isn't, the New York Post has run this, but it isn't actually out there all over the place in a way that it probably should be. And I don't think that's a coincidence. There are larger issues here, in that the media oftentimes, even among the horrible, depraved people, will protect their own. And Hefner was always a useful foil against those puritanical Christians. I mentioned the Jerry Falwell Jr. profile in Vanity Fair and how he wants people to know he's not the religious person they seem to think he is because of his name. And the media, of course, loved a guy like Hugh Hefner, who could ridicule and harass the Jerry Falwell Seniors of the world, the Pat Robertsons, the Billy Grahams, anyone who was Christian. And having used him forever, remember, there was an entire show about life at the Playboy Mansion on, I think it was A&E. They celebrated it as if it was good. And now some of the women who were involved in that show are speaking out on how they were very often drugged. They were forced to perform indecent acts on other men while Hefner watched. They were forced to perform in all sorts of awful acts. One woman said at one point he sodomized her and she left bleeding. Another person said that he one time had a adult film star come back to the mansion, and they plied her full of drugs and alcohol and then forced her to perform acts on a German Shepherd. Another woman caught Hugh Hefner abusing her dog. Said it was a one-time thing, he said. She wouldn't leave the dog alone with him. Some of the more recent film stars talk about how disgusting he was, and yet they lived there. They wanted the fame, they wanted the celebrity, and he gave it to many of them. Some of them have now come out and talked about Bill Cosby's time at the Playboy Mansion and the awful things that Bill Cosby would do. Well, now we know about Bill Cosby, and not from this. I'm struck by several things about the story, and yes, I do think it's relevant and worth talking about here for a lot of reasons. One of those things is the lack of news it has actually generated. There's a woman who has, a woman has come out, she's doing a documentary, and she's gotten a lot of the women who lived at the Playboy Mansion to come out and admit what was going on. And it's horrible, horrible stuff. I want to, I'm doing this spur of the moment, and I want to read for you. This is the New York Times obituary for Donald Rumsfeld. Defense Secretary during Iraq War is dead at 88. Subtitle: Mr. Rumsfeld, who served 4 presidents, oversaw a war that many said never should have been fought. But he said the removal of Saddam Hussein had created a more stable and secure world. Here's the New York Times obituary for Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner, who built the Playboy empire and embodied it, dies at 91. There's no subheadline. Let's delve into this, shall we? Hugh Hefner, who created Playboy magazine and spun it into a media and entertainment industry giant, all the while as its very public avatar, squiring attractive young women and sometimes marrying them well into his 80s. Died on Wednesday at his home, the Playboy Mansion in Holmby Hills area of Los Angeles. He was 91. Hefner the man and Playboy the brand were inseparable. Both advertised themselves as emblems of the sexual revolution, an escape from American priggishness and wider social intolerance. Both were derided over the years as vulgar, as adolescent, as exploitative, and finally as anachronistic. But Mr. Hefner was a stunning success from the moment he emerged in the 1950s. His timing was perfect. And you don't really dive down into any of this with any of the sordid criticism. In fact, if anything, they still kind of praise him, kind of excited with him, kind of admiring him. In fact, in his obituary, which is very lengthy in the New York Times, he goes on to talk about it, quoted at length before his death on how feminists should praise him for empowering women. And it turns out he wasn't empowering women. He was enslaving them to drugs and alcohol and abusing them and letting others abuse them. And in some cases, pressuring them so that they would say it was consensual when it really wasn't. And he died ultimately praised by the media that propped him up and made him an icon and the antipathy of Christianity and good social values and social norms. And now we actually know he was the monster many of us always said he was. Now, this is the New York Times praising him. The New York Times, of course, has a history of this. Walter Duranty was the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times for 14 years after the Bolsheviks took over the Soviet Union, and he became a propagandist for Stalin in the pages of the New York Times. He covered up the famine in the Ukraine. Won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way. The Pulitzer Board has declined to revoke the award for Walter Duranty. The New York Times ultimately called it a shameful period, but they had loved Walter Duranty until very recently. The media tends to prop up the left, but not just the left, a very particular form of the left. They tend to prop up those who would vulgarize American society or show contempt for American society in ways that show contempt for, lack of a better term, the virtuousness of American society. And now as word is trickling out, there really isn't a ton of coverage of this. Now I'm looking, I just pulled this up, just in Googling Hugh Hefner. And let me read you some of the headlines that are out there today on this. BuzzFeed News, Holly Madison opens up about the gross experience of sleeping with Hefner. That's from BuzzFeed. CNN, Secrets of Playboy, pulls back the curtain on the dark side of Hefner's empire. USA Today, Secrets of Playboy, Hugh Hefner's former girlfriend's playmates and employees allege a culture of abuse. All of these media outlets were fans of his in his life and at his death. And now, to some degree, it's A&E is revisiting its past sins now that he's dead. There's a larger, bigger issue here. And all of that sets the stage for this. The left doesn't really make its own accountable unless they become an embarrassment to them. Harvey Weinstein became a liability to the left, so they had to destroy Harvey Weinstein. Kevin Spacey became a liability to the left, but they're probably going to let him rehabilitate himself. When you become a liability to the left, that's when they come after you. But unless you're a liability, they don't come after you. And Hugh Hefner funded, propped up, and not only that, but aided and abetted the vices of the left. There are ample stories of reporters going to cover him, and he would let them in on the drugs, the alcohol, and the sex. And all of the profiles were flattering. And I have to tell you, all you have to do is use some common sense. When you have a man who built his entire empire on pornography and bragging about all the women he sleeps with and dating 3 women at a time, you should know just by virtue of common sense this is not a good or decent person. But those are the values, the hedonistic lifestyle, so many people prop up in the left. And this is not to be prudish, anything like that. This is just to be grounded in common sense, reality, and truth. The media props this stuff up. They love to get away with it. They love to use that as a juxtaposition for the left. Look at the Vanity Fair profile of Jerry Falwell Jr. Vanity Fair sat down for repeated conversations over an 8-month period with Jerry Falwell Jr. to essentially let him explain himself and out himself as someone who really isn't the religious Jerry Falwell. And they let him lament that, his mother was the true believer. His mother really was the Baptist who didn't drink. And his mother really expected them to go to church on Sunday. And his brother Jonathan, he went along with it. His brother Jonathan, he was pliable and controllable by that religiously fundamentalist mom. But I'm not like that. I like the good times. And suddenly, he becomes useful to the left. The hedonism of American society is not actually a good thing. We live in a day and age where people like to think it's a good thing. We live in a day where people, they just let the good times roll. Go live a hedonistic, unaccountable lifestyle. And they prop it all up. And oftentimes what they're doing is they're selling you a lie. More often than not, they're selling you a lie. And even now, as these words are starting to trickle out, as the story is starting to trickle out, the media doesn't really even want to deal with it. They don't want to grapple with their complicity in it. They sold people a bill of goods, a lie. Their sins will find them out. But ultimately, there's also this. He may have died, and he may have died to the praise of the press. He may have been a paragon of the lifestyle we should live, that Playboy lifestyle, lionized by members of the media, on the left in particular. But he can't escape judgment. Neither can you or me.